On the morning of March the 17th, 1984, Susan Fletcher was standing in her garage holding a tackle box that would dismantle her marriage. And inside that tackle box were bundles of $100 bills that had no explanation she could reconcile with the life she thought she'd been living. Her husband Thomas had left for his Saturday fishing trip 17 minutes earlier, and she'd discovered the cash only because he'd forgotten the tackle box itself, leaving it on the workbench near his collection of screwdrivers and socket wrenches, and she'd picked it up intending to drive it to Lake Washington, where he spent every Saturday morning supposedly casting lines into water that rarely yielded any actual fish. Susan and Thomas had been married for 14 years. They lived in a suburb of Seattle, in a neighborhood where Boeing engineers and their families occupied neat houses with trimmed lawns and two-car garages, where the aerospace industry's presence saturated every conversation and career trajectory. Thomas was 42 years old and worked as an electrical engineer specializing in military aircraft systems, a position he'd held since graduating from the University of Washington in 1970. Susan was 39, worked part-time as a bookkeeper for a local accounting firm, and spent her non-work hours managing the household rhythms that kept their family functioning. They had 2 children. David was 12, serious and bookish, already showing signs of his father's analytical mind. Emily was 9, more outgoing, the kind of child who befriended every classmate and brought home stray cats she found in the neighborhood. Thomas's fishing habit had been a constant throughout their marriage. Every Saturday morning at 6 o'clock, he would load his gear into the trunk of their Buick sedan and drive to Lake Washington, returning around noon with stories about the ones that got away, and occasionally, though not often, with actual fish that Susan would clean and cook for dinner. She'd never questioned the ritual. It seemed harmless enough, a man's need for solitude and the outdoors, the kind of hobby that kept him balanced against the pressures of his classified work at Boeing. The tackle box had been surprisingly heavy when she'd lifted it from the workbench. The weight didn't match what she expected from plastic lures and fishing line, and the latch, which should have been secure, had been loose, barely catching, and when she'd adjusted her grip, the box had opened and cash had spilled across the concrete floor of the garage. Bundles of $100 bills, each wrapped with rubber bands, each bundle thick enough that she estimated roughly 50 bills per stack. She'd stood there for several seconds, frozen, trying to process what she was seeing. Then she'd knelt down and gathered the money back into the tackle box, counting as she went. 15 bundles, possibly 20. She couldn't be certain without removing all of them and conducting a proper inventory, but her bookkeeper's instinct suggested somewhere between $15,000 and $20,000. Her first thought had been inheritance. Perhaps Thomas's uncle had died and left money he hadn't mentioned yet, but that didn't explain why it was hidden in fishing gear. Her second thought had been gambling, that Thomas had been betting on games and winning, stockpiling cash he planned to surprise her with eventually. But Thomas wasn't a gambler. He was cautious with money, methodical, the kind of man who balanced their checkbook to the penny and maintained spreadsheets for household expenses. Her third thought, the one that made her hands shake as she closed the tackle box and set it back on the workbench, was that she had no idea where this money had come from or why her husband was concealing it. She didn't drive to Lake Washington. She didn't bring Thomas his forgotten tackle box. Instead, she went back into the house, made coffee, and sat at the kitchen table trying to construct a framework that would make sense of what she'd found. The money itself wasn't necessarily sinister. People kept cash for various reasons, but the location, hidden inside equipment associated with a weekly routine that took Thomas away from home for 6 hours every Saturday, suggested something more deliberate than simple privacy. It suggested active concealment. It suggested that whatever Thomas was doing, he'd gone to considerable lengths to ensure she wouldn't discover it. Thomas returned home at 11:47 that morning, exactly on schedule, carrying his fishing rod and tackle box, the one he kept in the car, not the one she'd found in the garage. He kissed her cheek, asked what was for lunch, and spent the afternoon working in his basement workshop on some project involving circuit boards and soldering equipment. He seemed entirely normal. He didn't mention forgetting anything. He didn't seem anxious or suspicious. And Susan realized, watching him move through their house with the ease of someone who had nothing to hide, that he had no idea she'd opened the tackle box. He had no idea she knew. She would spend the next 8 weeks discovering that her husband was not the man she thought she'd married. Susan began checking the tackle box every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon when Thomas was at work and the children were at school. She would go into the garage, open the box carefully, and document what she found. She used her Polaroid camera, the one they'd bought for family photos, and she took pictures of the cash from multiple angles, making sure the rubber bands and the denominations were visible in each shot. Then she would close the box, return it to its exact position on the workbench, and go upstairs to her sewing room, where she kept a notebook hidden inside a fabric bin, beneath remnants of cotton and denim she used for quilting projects. In that notebook, she recorded dates and amounts and any changes she observed. On March 24th, she noted that the money had decreased. 2 bundles were missing, approximately $2,000 gone since her initial discovery. On April 3rd, new bundles had appeared, but these had different bank bands, pale green instead of white, suggesting they'd come from a different source or been obtained at a different time. The money wasn't static. It was flowing in and out, active rather than saved, which meant Thomas was using it for something and replenishing it from somewhere, and both the spending and the source remained completely opaque to her. She began examining Thomas's behavior through the lens of suspicion rather than trust. His Saturday fishing trips, which she'd accepted for 14 years as exactly what they appeared to be, now seemed worth closer scrutiny. She started tracking them systematically. She noted when he left, using the kitchen timer to mark exact departure times, and when he returned, writing down the duration of each absence. The pattern was remarkably consistent. Thomas left every Saturday between 6 and 6:15 in the morning and returned between 11:30 and noon, 5 to 6 hours. But the fish he brought home were rare, maybe once every 2 months. And when he did return with fish, they were often small, the kind that could have been caught in 20 minutes, not 6 hours. On April 7th, Susan decided to follow him. She waited until Thomas had been gone for 10 minutes, long enough that he wouldn't notice her car behind him, but soon enough that she might still locate him if he'd gone to his usual spot. She drove to Lake Washington, to the public access point where Thomas claimed to fish, and she didn't see his Buick in the parking lot. She drove along the perimeter road, checking other access points, other parking areas, and found nothing. He wasn't at Lake Washington. The following Saturday, April 14th, she followed him more carefully. She stayed 3 or 4 car lengths back, watching as he drove not toward the lake, but north toward the University of Washington campus. He parked in a residential area near a small park, sat in his car for approximately 20 minutes, then got out and walked into a wooded area adjacent to the park. Susan parked where she could observe from a distance, and she waited. 15 minutes later, Thomas emerged from the trees, returned to his car, and drove home. He never removed his fishing rod from the trunk. He never approached water. Whatever he was doing during those Saturday mornings had nothing to do with fishing. Susan's search of the house began the following week. She moved through each room methodically when Thomas was at Boeing and the children were at school. She checked closets and drawers and cabinets. She looked behind furniture and under mattresses and inside storage boxes in the attic. In the basement, in Thomas's workshop area where he kept his tools and electrical equipment, She found nothing unusual at first. But then she noticed the space behind the water heater, a cramped corner where Thomas had stacked old paint cans and cleaning supplies, and wedged behind those items was a small metal box, approximately 8 inches by 6 inches, with a combination lock securing the lid. She spent the next 3 days searching for the combination or a key or any way to access the contents of that box. She checked Thomas's desk drawers, his filing cabinet, the glove compartment of his car. On April 26th, while cleaning the garage, she opened the electrical panel box mounted on the wall near the workbench. The gray metal cabinet where circuit breakers controlled power to different parts of the house, and taped to the inside of the door was a small key. The key opened the metal box. Inside was a notebook, a spiral bound, filled with columns of numbers and abbreviations. Each page was dated, entries going back to January 1981, more than 3 years of documented transactions or activities or something Susan couldn't immediately decipher. Some entries were in English, combinations of letters and numbers that might have been codes or shorthand. Other entries were in Cyrillic characters, Russian, unmistakable even to someone who couldn't read the language. Susan's hands were shaking as she turned the pages. She took the notebook upstairs, photocopied every page on the small copier Thomas kept in his home office, returned the notebook to the metal box, locked it, and replaced the key inside the electrical panel. That night, lying in bed next to Thomas while he slept, Susan thought about their wedding in 1970, how young they'd been, how certain she'd felt about the life they were building together. She thought about the house they'd bought in 1975, about David's birth in 1972, and Emily's in 1975. About ordinary moments that seemed in retrospect like they might have been performances rather than genuine experiences. She wondered if Thomas had targeted her deliberately, or if the recruitment had come later, if their marriage had been engineered from the beginning, or corrupted somewhere along the way. She thought about all the times he'd brought his briefcase home from Boeing, all the classified materials that might have passed through their house, and whether she'd been sleeping next to a stranger for 14 years. By late April, Susan had built a complete file of evidence. She had Polaroid photographs of the cash with dates written on the back of each picture. She had photocopies of every page from Thomas's notebook, 37 pages total, showing 3 years of entries that included Russian words she couldn't translate, but recognized as foreign. She had her own handwritten log documenting Thomas's fake fishing trips, the times he left and returned, the locations where he actually went instead of the lake. And on April 28th, she had followed him again and watched something that made everything unmistakably clear. Thomas had driven to the same park near the University of Washington. He had parked his car and walked to a bench overlooking a pond. Another man was already sitting there, reading a newspaper. Thomas sat down on the opposite end of the same bench. The two men never looked at each other. They never spoke. They sat there for maybe 5 minutes, both of them staring straight ahead like strangers who happened to choose the same place to rest. Then Thomas stood up, leaving a folded newspaper on the bench beside him, and walked back to his car. The other man waited another minute, picked up the newspaper Thomas had left, tucked it under his arm, and walked away in a different direction. Susan understood what she had witnessed even though she'd never seen anything like it before. This was how secrets were passed between people who didn't want to be seen together. This was espionage. Her husband wasn't just hiding money. He was meeting with someone and exchanging information, and the Russian writing in his notebook and the cash in his tackle box and the fake fishing trips all suddenly formed a picture that was both complete and devastating. The question that kept Susan awake for the next week wasn't whether to report Thomas to the FBI. She knew she had to report him. The question was what would happen to David and Emily when she did. They were 12 and 9 years old. They had no idea their father was living a secret life. If Susan reported him, he would be arrested. There would be a trial. It would be in newspapers. Everyone at their school would know. Their friends' parents would know. David and Emily would become the children whose father was a Soviet spy, and that label would follow them for the rest of their lives. People would wonder if Susan had known, if she had helped, if the whole family had been involved. The children would be questioned and investigated and suspected of things they knew nothing about. But if Susan didn't report Thomas, she would be letting him continue. Every week, he would keep passing Boeing secrets to the Soviets. American military technology would be compromised because she chose to protect her family's reputation instead of her country's security. And if Thomas was eventually caught by someone else, if the FBI discovered him through their own investigation, Susan would be guilty of knowing and doing nothing. She would go to prison herself for covering up crimes she had witnessed and documented. She spent hours in her car during the lunch breaks from her bookkeeping job, parked in empty lots around Seattle, trying to solve a problem that had no good solution. Every choice led to destruction. Report Thomas and destroy the children's lives. Don't report Thomas and become a criminal herself. There was no path forward that didn't end in catastrophe for someone she loved. Susan thought about the Cold War, about what she'd learned in school and read in newspapers. It was 1984. Ronald Reagan was president. Tensions with the Soviet Union were high. People who betrayed their country went to prison for decades. Thomas wouldn't get a light sentence. He would be gone for 20 years, maybe more. David would be in his 30s before his father was released. Emily would be almost 30. They would grow up without him, and they would grow up knowing what he had done. On May 8th, Susan made her decision. She would report Thomas to the FBI, but she would also create a story that would protect David and Emily from the truth. She wouldn't tell them their father was a spy. She would tell them something else, something that would explain his absence without destroying their image of him. She would tell them that Boeing was sending him overseas for a classified defense project, that he had to leave suddenly and couldn't say goodbye, that he would be gone for a long time working on something important for the country. It was a lie, but it was a lie that would let them remember their father as a good man instead of a traitor. She practiced the conversation in her mirror. She wrote down exactly what she would say. She planned how she would answer their questions, and on the evening of May 8th, she had dinner with Thomas and David and Emily, knowing it was the last normal meal they would ever share as a family. Thomas talked about a project at Boeing. Emily showed them a drawing she'd made at school. David asked if they could get a dog, and Susan watched them all, memorizing the moment, because tomorrow she would walk into an FBI office and everything would change forever. On May 9th, 1984, at 2:30 in the afternoon, Susan Fletcher walked into the FBI field office in downtown Seattle, carrying a manila envelope that contained 3 months of documentation. She told the receptionist she had information about espionage activities, and after a brief wait, she was escorted to a small conference room where Special Agent Margaret Dawson introduced herself and asked Susan to explain why she was there. Susan laid out everything methodically. She showed the Polaroid photographs of cash bundles arranged in the tackle box, each photo dated on the back. She presented photocopies of Thomas's notebook with its columns of numbers and Russian writing. She provided her handwritten surveillance log tracking his movements over 8 weeks, the times he left for his fake fishing trips and the places he actually went. She described watching him meet another man at a park bench, the exchange of newspapers, the deliberate way they avoided acknowledging each other. Agent Dawson listened without interrupting, taking notes, occasionally asking clarifying questions about dates or locations or specific details. The meeting lasted 3 hours. Dawson brought in another agent, a man named Robert Chen, who specialized in counterintelligence, and Susan repeated portions of her account while Chen examined the photocopied notebook pages. When Susan insisted that her children could not be told the truth about their father's arrest, that they needed to be protected from knowing he was a spy, Dawson's expression shifted from professional sympathy to visible discomfort. She explained that the FBI couldn't actively participate in deceiving minors, that there were ethical and potentially legal complications with constructing false narratives for family members. Susan's response was quiet but firm. Her children were 12 and 9 years old. They would be destroyed if they knew the truth. They would carry the stigma for the rest of their lives. She was asking for help protecting them from something they had no part in creating. Dawson left the room to consult with supervisors. She returned 40 minutes later and said the FBI would accommodate Susan's request within certain parameters. They would arrest Thomas quietly, without media present if possible. They would coordinate the timing so Susan could manage how the children were informed. But Dawson also told Susan something that changed the context of everything she'd brought. The FBI had been investigating leaks from Boeing since late 1983. Documents related to military avionics systems had been showing up in Soviet intelligence reports. They suspected an insider, but hadn't been able to identify who. Susan's evidence gave them the connection they needed. Thomas Fletcher had security clearance that gave him access to exactly the kinds of materials that had been compromised. 3 days later, on Saturday morning, May 12th, while Thomas was preparing for another fishing trip, FBI agents arrived at the Fletcher house at 5:45. Susan answered the door. She'd been awake since 4, waiting, her stomach tight with anxiety. Thomas came to the door still holding his coffee mug, and Agent Dawson showed him the arrest warrant. He looked at the document, then at Susan, and his face shifted from confusion to recognition to something that looked like betrayal. He said, "You went through my things." Susan said, "I was bringing you your tackle box." Agents handcuffed him in the living room, read him his Miranda rights, and escorted him to an unmarked sedan parked in the driveway. The entire process took less than 25 minutes. David and Emily were still asleep upstairs. Other agents searched the house while Thomas was being transported. They removed the tackle box from the garage, the metal box from behind the water heater, a camera Susan hadn't known existed that was hidden in Thomas's workshop, and $8,000 in cash they found in a false bottom of his tool drawer. Susan signed documentation acknowledging the seizure of evidence. By 7:30, the agents were gone, and the house was quiet again except for the sound of Susan's children beginning to wake up in their bedrooms. That afternoon, Susan gathered David and Emily in the living room. She used the script she'd rehearsed. She told them their father had been assigned to a very important Boeing project overseas, classified defense work in Europe that he couldn't discuss with anyone. She said it had happened suddenly, an emergency situation where the government needed his expertise immediately, and he'd had to leave before he could say goodbye properly. She said he would be gone for a long time, possibly years, because the work was critical to national security. She showed them an atlas and pointed vaguely at Europe, creating a fiction of distance and importance. David, who was 12 and naturally skeptical, asked why their father hadn't mentioned anything the night before. Susan explained that classified projects worked that way, that sometimes people in defense industries got called away with almost no notice, that it was part of serving the country. Emily, who was 9 and crying, asked when he would come back. Susan said they didn't know exactly, that it depended on how long the project took, but that they had to be brave and support him by being strong at home. The children were confused, but they accepted her explanation because they had no framework for understanding any alternative. Parents were authorities. When a mother said something with conviction, children believed it. Susan sent them to their rooms to process the news, and then she went to the master bedroom and closed the door. She sat on the edge of the bed she'd shared with Thomas for 14 years, and she understood that she'd made a choice that was simultaneously an act of protection and an act of profound deception. She'd destroyed her husband but preserved his image for their children, and she would have to maintain that lie for as long as it took, knowing that eventually, inevitably, the truth would surface, and her children would have to reckon not just with their father's betrayal, but with hers as well. Between June and August of 1984, Thomas Fletcher moved through the federal criminal justice system from initial detention to formal charges to plea negotiations. He maintained his innocence for the first month, claiming the money was from legitimate sources, and the notebook entries were personal records that had nothing to do with espionage. But as federal prosecutors presented evidence that included not just Susan's documentation, but FBI surveillance photographs of Thomas meeting with a known Soviet intelligence officer, his defense collapsed. In July, he agreed to a plea deal that would reduce his potential sentence in exchange for full cooperation. Thomas's confession, given over 3 days of interviews with FBI agents and counterintelligence specialists, revealed that he'd been recruited in 1980 by a man posing as a fishing equipment salesman who had approached him at a sporting goods store. The initial contact had seemed innocent, a conversation about lures and tackle, but over subsequent meetings the man had gradually shifted the discussion toward Thomas's work at Boeing, asking casual questions that became less casual over time. By early 1981, Thomas was photographing classified documents related to avionics systems and radar technology, receiving between $3,000 and $5,000 for each delivery. The dead drops had evolved from simple exchanges to the more sophisticated park bench method Susan had witnessed. Over 3 years, Thomas had been paid approximately $180,000, most of which he'd spent paying off debts and making house improvements that Susan had assumed were funded by his Boeing salary. In August, Thomas pleaded guilty to unauthorized disclosure of classified information to a foreign power. On August 29th, he appeared before a federal judge in the Western District of Washington for sentencing. His attorney argued for leniency based on cooperation, and claimed Thomas had been manipulated by sophisticated intelligence operatives. Federal prosecutors argued that Thomas had been motivated primarily by greed, and that his cooperation had failed to lead to any additional arrests since his Soviet handler had vanished immediately after the failed park bench meeting. The judge sentenced him to 28 years in federal prison. Within a week, Thomas was transferred to a federal correctional facility in California, 800 miles from Seattle, and Susan received notification that all marital assets were frozen pending civil forfeiture proceedings since the government considered much of their property to be proceeds from espionage. Susan told her employer at the accounting firm that Thomas had been assigned to classified overseas work. She told neighbors the same story. She told the children's teachers so they would understand if David or Emily seemed distracted or troubled. And once a month, she sat down at the kitchen table and wrote letters she pretended were from Thomas abroad. She wrote about missing the children, about being proud of their accomplishments, about how important the work was, even though he couldn't describe it. She read these letters aloud to David and Emily, performing the role of postal intermediary, creating the illusion that their father was thinking of them from somewhere far away. David grew more suspicious as months accumulated into years. By 1985, when he was 13, he was asking questions that Susan found increasingly difficult to answer. Why couldn't they call him even once? What exactly was he doing that required complete communication silence? Why hadn't Boeing sent any official notification about the assignment? Susan deflected with vague references to security protocols and classified requirements, but she could see David's trust eroding with each inadequate explanation. Emily, who was 10 in 1985, remained more accepting. She wrote letters to her father regularly, filling pages with descriptions of school activities and friends and things she wanted to tell him. Susan kept every letter Emily wrote in a box in her closet because there was nowhere to mail them. The act of writing seemed to comfort Emily, to maintain some sense of connection, and Susan didn't have the heart to tell her that the letters would never be read. The financial strain became severe quickly. Susan had assumed she would receive some form of support as the wife of a Boeing employee on assignment, but Thomas's termination from Boeing and the government's seizure of assets left her with almost nothing. She took a full-time position as a secretary at an insurance company, working longer hours for less money than her bookkeeping job had provided. She sold furniture piece by piece, downsized their lifestyle, explained to David and Emily that they needed to be careful with money while their father was away. Some neighbors were sympathetic, bringing casseroles and offering help. Others were clearly suspicious, and Susan could sense the whispers and speculation that followed her at the grocery store or the bank. Christmas of 1985 was particularly difficult. Emily asked why her father couldn't come home even for a few days, why the project was so important that he had to miss every holiday. Susan manufactured elaborate explanations about international security and government restrictions, and she watched Emily's face as the child tried to reconcile her father's absence with the importance her mother kept insisting his work carried. By 1988, 4 years into the deception, Susan had settled into a rhythm of maintained fiction. She wrote monthly letters from Thomas. She answered the children's questions with practiced responses. She went to work and paid bills and managed a household that looked functional from the outside, but was built entirely on lies. And every night, lying alone in her bedroom, she wondered how much longer she could sustain it. In the spring of 1990, David turned 18. He was preparing to graduate from high school and filling out college applications when he asked Susan for information he needed about his father for financial aid forms. He needed Thomas's overseas address, his employer contact information, details that Susan couldn't provide without exposing the fabrication. She hesitated, evaded, gave vague answers that David recognized immediately as deflection. That hesitation, after 6 years of careful performance, was the crack that brought everything down. David called Boeing's Human Resources Department independently. He identified himself as Thomas Fletcher's son and asked for information about his father's overseas assignment. The HR representative was confused. Thomas Fletcher hadn't worked at Boeing since 1984. David hung up and went to the public library where he searched through newspaper archives. He found a small article from May 1984, barely 3 paragraphs, with the headline, "Boeing Engineer Sentenced in Espionage Case." The article named Thomas Fletcher and reported that he'd pleaded guilty to passing classified information to Soviet intelligence and had been sentenced to 28 years in federal prison. David came home that afternoon and placed the photocopied newspaper article on the kitchen table, in front of Susan. He asked her how long she'd been planning to lie to him. Susan's defense, that she'd been protecting him and Emily from unbearable knowledge, sounded hollow even as she said it. David's response was cold and precise. He asked what gave her the right to decide what truth he could handle. He asked how she could have stolen 6 years of reality from him and replaced it with fiction. He asked if she understood that the lie itself was a betrayal, separate from, and possibly worse than their father's original crime. Emily learned the truth days later when David told her. She was 15, and her reaction was quieter than David's, but equally devastating. She'd written dozens of letters to a father who'd never received them, had maintained hope for a reunion that was never going to happen the way she'd imagined, had organized her understanding of the world around a story that had never been true. The family structure that Susan had worked for 6 years to preserve collapsed in a matter of weeks. David moved out after his high school graduation, renting a room near the University of Washington campus where he'd been accepted, and he spoke to Susan only when absolutely necessary. Emily withdrew into silence, spending hours in her room, eventually asking to see a therapist because she didn't know how to process the double betrayal of both her father's crimes and her mother's lies. And Susan was left alone in a house that had once held a family, but now contained only the wreckage of choices she'd made believing she was doing what mothers were supposed to do, which was protect their children from pain, even when that protection required building walls made entirely of deception. Between 1990 and 1995, the Fletcher family existed in a state of fractured communication, where the connections that had once held them together were replaced by careful distance and managed interactions. David finished college in California, chose a university as far from Seattle as he could justify, and returned home only for obligatory visits that lasted no more than a weekend. Emily completed high school and enrolled at a university in Oregon, close enough to visit occasionally, but far enough to establish her own life separate from the history that had defined her childhood. Both children blamed Susan for the lies as much as they blamed Thomas for the crimes, and that dual resentment created a barrier that therapy and time couldn't fully dissolve. In 1992, David and Emily began visiting Thomas in prison. The first visits were painful, filled with questions that had been accumulating for 8 years. They asked him why he'd done it, whether any of their family life had been real, whether he'd thought about them at all when he was photographing classified documents and accepting Soviet money. Thomas's explanations that he'd been under financial pressure in 1980, that the recruitment had been gradual and sophisticated, that he'd been afraid to stop once he'd started, sounded inadequate against the magnitude of what he'd destroyed. But over subsequent visits, something resembling a relationship began to form between Thomas and his children, built on honesty about his failures and their shared understanding that he would be in prison until they were middle-aged. Susan never visited Thomas in prison. He wrote to her occasionally, brief letters that expressed gratitude for how she'd raised David and Emily alone, that acknowledged the impossible situation she'd been placed in. Susan kept the letters in a drawer, but never responded. She couldn't forgive him for turning their marriage into a cover for espionage, and he couldn't forgive her for turning him in, and the combination meant that whatever they'd had together was permanently finished. The children's visits to Thomas created a strange dynamic where David and Emily maintained relationships with both parents separately, but rarely brought them together. Thanksgiving of 1993, David and Emily drove to California to spend the holiday with Thomas in the prison visiting room, whilst Susan ate dinner alone in Seattle. Christmas of 1994, they split their time, seeing Susan for a few hours before driving to see Thomas, fulfilling obligations to both parents while enjoying neither visit particularly. The central issue that therapy helped David and Emily articulate but couldn't resolve was that Susan had denied them agency during the most formative period of their adolescence. She'd decided what truth they could handle and what truth needed to be hidden, and in doing so she'd stolen their ability to process their father's betrayal in real time. Instead, they'd spent 6 years living inside an elaborate fiction, building their understanding of family and trust on foundations that didn't exist. And when the truth finally emerged, it hadn't just destroyed their image of their father, but their ability to trust their mother's account of reality. Thomas was released from federal prison in 2003, after serving 19 years. Parole restrictions prevented him from working in defense industries or traveling freely, and he found employment as an electrician for commercial buildings in Tacoma. He was 61 years old, had missed his children's entire 20s and early 30s, and was starting over in a world that had changed dramatically since 1984. David was 31, working as an engineer in San Diego, married with 2 children Thomas had never met. Emily was 28, teaching high school English in Portland, engaged to a man she'd been dating for 3 years. Thomas and his children maintained limited contact after his release. They had dinner together every few months, phone calls on birthdays and holidays, a relationship that was cordial but carried permanent scar tissue. Thomas wrote to Susan multiple times between 2003 and 2008, asking to meet, to explain things that had never been fully explained, to apologize for destroying what they'd built together. Susan refused all contact. She'd moved forward alone and saw no reason to revisit a past that had already taken too much from her. In 2007, Emily got married, and both Thomas and Susan attended the ceremony. They saw each other for the first time in 23 years. Thomas was older, grayer, wearing a rented suit that didn't quite fit. Susan was smaller somehow, aged in ways that went beyond simple time. They spoke briefly, politely, the kind of conversation strangers have at weddings. Emily had asked them both to walk her down the aisle, and they did, each parent on one side, united by their daughter but separated by everything else. The wedding photographer captured them in a single frame, 3 people connected by biology and history but fundamentally alone. Susan was diagnosed with early-onset dementia in 2010. David and Emily became her caregivers by necessity, moving her into an assisted living facility when it became clear she could no longer manage independently. While sorting through her belongings in the family house, preparing it for sale, they found a locked trunk in the attic neither of them had known existed. Inside were all the materials from Susan's 1984 investigation, the Polaroid photographs of cash in the tackle box, her handwritten surveillance logs tracking Thomas's movements, photocopies of the notebook pages with Russian writing, her notes from FBI meetings. And underneath all of that, wrapped in rubber bands, were the fake letters she'd written pretending to be Thomas abroad, and every letter Emily had written to her father that had never been sent. David and Emily sat on the attic floor reading through the materials, and for the first time they saw their mother's methodical work, the evidence she'd compiled, the impossible choice she'd faced in 1984, when she'd had to decide between protecting her country and protecting her children. They saw the care she'd taken documenting everything, the precision of her investigation, and the elaborate construction of the lie she'd maintained for 6 years. It didn't erase the betrayal they'd felt when the truth emerged, but it provided context they hadn't fully understood before, which was that Susan had been trying to save them from something she believed would destroy them, and in trying to save them she'd created a different kind of destruction that had proven equally damaging. Susan Fletcher died in December 2012 at the age of 67. Thomas attended the funeral, sitting in the back of the chapel, and David and Emily spoke about their mother's sacrifice and her impossible choice, and acknowledged that they still didn't know whether she'd been right to lie. The story of Susan and Thomas Fletcher is not about right and wrong. It is about the mathematics of impossible choices, where every solution creates casualties and there are no answers, only consequences that ripple forward through decades and leave families permanently altered by decisions made in garages on Saturday mornings when tackle boxes reveal secrets that dismantle everything.